Hi, everyone, and good evening. I'm Fatima, and I'm an MSc student in Evidence Based Social Interventions and Policy Evaluation. And I'll be talking a little bit about my research topic a little more broadly, and then towards the end, more focused towards my research, which basically focuses on the intersection of social protection, climate change induced disasters, and more broadly, multidimensional poverty, but in particular, impact on children's welfare, especially education and child labor. This is particularly important in this context to discuss social protection because it becomes even more salient and critical when people are affected by climate change-induced disasters, as it can help provide the support and resources that are necessary to act as a social safety net to help those who are exposed to climate shocks, to help them cope with the disasters and build resilience. But first, to discuss who is most affected by climate shocks and is in most need of this social protection, while anyone who might be affected by a climate shock such as a heat wave, a drought, a flood, would be affected in multiple ways. Their health would be affected, their income sources might be affected, but those who undergo or who experience multidimensional poverty are those who are most affected in two ways. Because those who were exposed to deprivations across these multiple dimensions, which you can see as per the index, across health, education, and living standards, because they reside in high-risk areas with limited resources, limited capacity to respond to the shock, they are more exposed and vulnerable to climate change. And in turn, climate change also exacerbates these deprivations across these different levels. Particularly, I'd like to point out a recent publication, which is a report published by UNDP and the Oxford Poverty Development Center. And they found that nearly 8 in 10 people living in multidimensional poverty, and multidimensional poverty, we mean that people who may or may not be income poor, that is, they may or may not be living below the poverty line, but they may be experiencing one or more deprivations across one of these three domains. And 8 in 10 of these people, they're directly exposed to climate hazards such as extreme heat, flooding, drought, or air pollution. And while multidimensionally poor people are more exposed, but this inequality and this impact is even more pronounced in people living in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. So as you can see on the graph, almost 99.9%, that is almost universally, people who are exposed to multidimensional poverty in South Asia are also exposed to at least one, if not more, climate hazards. And that has significant implications, not just in the immediate short term, but also in the long term. So how do these climate shocks affect households? So whenever a person or a household might be affected by a climate shock, they may undergo damage to infrastructure, to their livestock, and their livelihoods may be disrupted, which leads to income being destabilized, which strains the household capacity to respond to that shock and overcome the damages that they may have sustained. And this especially becomes pronounced with climate change-induced disasters becoming a more recurring activity. As they undergo one disaster after the other, their resilience and their coping capacity is really reduced. And so in response to any climate shock, they may undergo negative coping strategies such as reducing their food consumption, maybe selling an asset, taking on a loan, maybe withdrawing their child from school. And even to the extent that the child withdrawal from school, they may be pushed into child labor preemptively, and which, as we all are aware, it not only has immediate and short-term implications, but also long-term implications, not just for the child and the family, but also for the broader economy. And while the entire household or the populations that are affected by such disasters are significantly impacted, it is children who are disproportionately impacted. So just to consider two examples, that if a child is withdrawn from school and sent early on to participate in the labor force to make up for the lost income that a family has lost in the aftermath of a climate shock, we see evidence in the aftermath of 2005 earthquake in Pakistan that even 4 weeks of school closures or a child not attending school could actually lead to learning losses equivalent to 1.5 year academic year losses, it could lead to learning losses of 1.5 academic year 4 years later after the earthquake if it was not addressed with remedial and targeted education. And so we see that this not only has immediate, even though these coping strategies might be intended as more short-term and immediate and not long-term strategies by the household, research and evidence shows that it is unlikely for these children to go back to school, especially if they enter the labor force. And so this not only has impacts for the child and family, as I said earlier, but also for the broader social society and economy, and also for human capital. And particularly to discuss a case, which is also my research focus and my home country, Pakistan, we see that it is among the top 10 most climate change vulnerable countries. And because my research focuses particularly on the impact of a 2022 flash flood that occurred, and I'll discuss more on that in a minute. But this is just to show that floods is only one of the types of climate change-induced disasters. And over the years, as you can see, not only the frequency, but also the severity of its impact has increased substantially. And as we've discussed the pathway through which a climate shock can impact children's education and push them into labor, what I want to emphasize here is that Pakistan, even though it is a climate vulnerable country and it is exposed to multiple climate shocks, it is already going through an education and child labor crisis. Because my research focuses on the 2022 flash flood, so I'll take you a little bit over figures and stats from 2022. If you see on your left-hand side, this is a graph of the most climate-affected countries. And Pakistan was ranked the most climate-affected country in 2022 because the flash floods, they impacted not just the GDP, but they also led to mass fatalities because 33 million people were affected. A third of the country was inundated. And while it now seems like a flash flood that happened in 2022, its effects continue to linger on. And not just its effects, but because there have been more climate shocks over the years, it has only compounded. Just to look at the education sector, regardless of considering the climate change impacts, we see that in 2023, a survey found that almost 20 million children of school-going age were out of school, which makes it 32% of the national population of children of school-going age. And right now, this figure has risen to 26 million children. Child labor also remains quite high, and there's inconclusive evidence, but we see that there has been a surge in the recent years. This is the current scenario or the current situation for education, for climate vulnerability, and child labor. But to put this together into the puzzle, how climate change can really exacerbate the existing crises is something that we need to look at, not just from its impact perspective, but also how to respond to it. And one potential way to respond to these impacts is through social protection. Social protection in this particular dynamic, because we've seen how social protection through cash transfers, conditional cash transfers, and unconditional cash transfers and other support can help not just children, but also families. So for instance, we've seen examples from Brazil's Bolsa Familia, from Mexico's Progresa, that conditional cash transfers can actually lead to increased enrollment rates among children. But to see whether these might be more effective in climate vulnerable countries, it remains a matter of research. But it is one way to ensure that people or families or households that are vulnerable or exposed to climate shocks, the government through social protection can help protect not just support their short-term income, but also continue investing in long-term education and human capital development. And so in this context, my research basically utilizes a quasi-experimental design, and it looks at the 2022 flash floods and districts in Pakistan that were affected by the floods compared to which were not. And I look at how this has impacted children's education by looking at their withdrawal, that is through dropout rate, and their attendance rate. And also at child labor, how there has been an increase, or whether or not there has been an increase or effect on child labor outcomes in the aftermath of the 2022 floods. And particularly if this difference or this impact has been different in households that receive an unconditional cash transfer in Pakistan compared to those who do not. So while my research is still ongoing because I'm working on my thesis right now, the preliminary analysis does show that there is an effect, and households who receive the social protection, the social transfer, might have fared better, but we still need more evidence and more research to develop such programs and to respond to a crisis that is not only developing, but only exacerbating. Thank you so much.